Hello and welcome everybody to according to entry number 60, and we're doing a book review today, The Populist Moment. Sorry I wasn't posting last week. I was on vacation and just didn't have the means available to do that, and I missed yesterday because I just got back yesterday and I was too exhausted. So this is a makeup for Monday. Um, but while I was on vacation, I was able to get The Populist Moment done, and it is an excellent book. It's a short read. It's only 340 pages or so, 320. And it's definitely worth your while if you want to understand what's going on with Trump right now, if you want to understand what's going on with GameStop, if you want to understand economics better, if you want to start your own or if you want to start your own party. So I know Trump's looking to start the whatever party, the Patriot Party. A lot of stuff that they ran into in terms of difficulties are going to be highlighted in this book, The Populist Moment. Libertarians, I know, have been trying to get their party off the ground, and this will hopefully highlight some of the issues and other things that go along with that. And it also gets into economics and stuff like that, which I find very interesting. We're going to explore in more depth on a different podcast, but I just wanted to touch on that. And so, uh, basically, the gist of the book is of about the Populist Revolution, and basically this happened in the late 1800s after the Civil War. In about 1870, the uh, the war that was supposedly fought to free the slaves or whatever had created slavery once again in the South. So that's pretty questionable right there, in the form of the Croplean system. And so, just to touch on, this is a different book. I haven't read this book. I mainly did it for the picture, but these are a couple of the things that were going on. So you had greenbackers, Knights of Labor, and Populists. So the greenbackers were people that had come off of the war, and they had basically just printed money to be able to keep up with wartime demand. And that was very beneficial for all the farmers and a lot of the producers, as it made it so that they were able to get out of debt and be able to maintain their stuff. The Knights of Labor were an early movement to support labor, and they ended up not being very successful just because they hadn't figured out various tools of the trade, those being strikes and sit-in strikes and stuff like that. And so a lot of the strikes were able to be broken. And in this time, this was the time that was controlled by all the trusts. You had the steel, you had the railroads; those are the big ones, and all this other stuff. And so you have all these competing factions that are trying to just be able to survive. And so the idea behind the greenbackers, what had happened after the this is a bit of a synopsis of the whole book. What had happened after the Civil War was the people that had invested in the war and basically gotten a bunch of uh, these bonds for cheap or whatever, wanted to be able to redeem those bonds in pre-war money. And basically, what this would do is it would deflate the currency, and it would siphon all of the currency into the hands of the people, the people who are already rich. It's the classic. It's what's going on right now. Wall Street has always been able to get what they want when they want it, and uh, some of these political ads that you're seeing from the time kind of really highlight that, where you have all these people who are like, oh, I do all this stuff, and like, the farmer's always left holding the bag kind of thing, and it's like, do you really want to be pissing off the dude who feeds you? Now most of these farmers were uh, cotton cotton farmers, and I'm sure they had some small vegetable gardens and stuff like that to feed themselves, but for the most part they were cotton, because that was they had too much debt to be able to service things. So let's get into the Croplean system. I got slightly distracted by some of the slides I got here just because I wanted to address what was on the screen in front of you. So the Croplean system basically made it so a bunch of merchants. This is kind of to go with along with the carpetbagger thing, if you've heard that. A bunch of merchants went down to the south, and they basically the North had made it so all the money was wiped out after the Civil War. So nobody had any money. So the only way that they could get these farms up and running again was to go on credit. So these uh, merchants went down, and they said, "All right, well, I'll loan you these things, but uh, it's gonna cost you interest." And lo and behold, they charged so much interest. I've it's it was generally between like 100 and 200% interest. to get these things that they basically turned them into slaves immediately. All of them ended up losing their homes. They started working as tenant farmers instead of owning their own land, and all this stuff spiraled out of control because of basically because there was no check and anything to protect the farmers after the Civil War had ended. And this caused a lot of trouble, and people, and on top of that, these guys, so they would just basically be forced. This is in the South. This wasn't everywhere. And so this forced a lot of people to move to Texas, and in Texas they had their own issues. It wasn't necessarily the Croplean system, but throughout the Midwest area, Texas up to the Dakotas and Minnesota, that whole area, the Great Plains area, still couldn't get good prices for their crops. And this wasn't just cotton at this point. I think Texas was probably primarily growing cotton, but up in the Dakotas you had wheat and stuff like that. And one of the reasons that these guys were getting crushed is because they were taking out loans, and because they had to be able to sow their fields in the fall, and basically they the money supply for farmers was such that there was massive supply at one point of the year, and it was absolute drought at another point of the year, and they needed money in opposite cycles. So they basically, when the harvest would come in the fall, it would depress prices and make it so they couldn't get any money, so that they didn't have enough money to be able to buy the supplies come spring to be able to plant next year's crop. And the merchants and stuff like that used this to viciously eat them all up. Also, they had issues with railroads where they would ship stuff across on rail lines, and the shipping from like somewhere in North Dakota just to Minneapolis would cost the entire profit that they were going to make on that grain. And so nobody could make any money. People became absolutely destitute, and more of the land became consolidated under various corporate entities and stuff like that, instead of individual farmers. So this whole populist movement started out as a way to help redress some of these issues, and the idea was to not do it through politics, but to do it through this system where they collectivized, similar to how workers do it now, and they wanted to with the strikes and stuff like that, and they wanted to coordinate with that with the strikes, but they just didn't have some of the ideas and institutions in place to be able to pull that off at the time period. And so they gathered all their resources in one spot, and then used that to leverage up and make it so that they could actually get better deals. Now, in classic fashion, you saw this with the GME stock, and Trump and his whole thing is, turns out when people feel something that's threatening them, and the upper classes have to actually pay their fair share, as it were, they all seem to unite and be able to put their differences aside to absolutely crush the little guy. So that's what happened. Basically, all the banks colluded together to make sure that they couldn't get a loan to get their systems off. All the newspapers were running ads to completely crush them. The various people wouldn't sell to them or do anything like that. And so this collectivization effort basically failed, and they figured, okay, well, if literally no bank in the entire, this, and that's kind of what we're going through right now today, where they're like, oh, well, you don't like X, Y, and Z, why don't you just go build X, Y, and Z? And that's kind of what they experience, right? It's like, oh, well, you can't get a loan from a bank, why don't you just go make your own bank? Obviously, that's not an option because of all the regulations around banking. But that was kind of their solution to a certain extent, except their solution was to go around the entire issue and create one of the most genius things I've ever heard, and I think that we need to talk about in more detail, and I will talk about this in a separate podcast. It'll probably be tomorrow's, is the sub-treasury system. So basically the sub-treasury system, what it did is it changed the backing of the money, and this kind of goes to the idea of silver and gold and greenbacks. That was a major discussion around this time period, and the sub-treasury system basically made it so that the money was backed in that year's harvest, so it was flexible and it could grow with the economy as it needed to. And it also set a limit so that you couldn't just print it infinitely, and it was just a very unique and succinct system. I will get in. It's definitely more in depth than that, and I will get into that more on the next podcast. But it's a genius plan. But the problem is, and the money was to be printed and distributed directly from the Treasury. Now remember, this is 1870 to about 1900. The Fed does not exist yet. These kind of actions are what inspire people to install the Fed. And one of the reasons they wanted this inflation is because they were currently going through deflation and people were getting absolutely crushed. Sure, the wealthy were doing much better because that seems to be the no matter what, the wealthy win. Is kind of how it seems to be going. But the deflation was making it so that they had to take out loans, and they were already, like, even if with inflation, like 200% interest, you're never paying that back. But now you have deflation, so you're increasing your overall amount of yield year on year, but the amount of money that you can get for it is going down and down and down because there's just no money circulating within the economy. And I know certain people will say that's a good thing, and under certain circumstances that might be a good thing. When deflation moves wealth from inflated assets into other parts of the economy, then it makes sense. So like right now, if we go through a deflation, it would probably be in housing, and that would be a good thing because it would be moving wealth from the boomers who have way too much wealth into the hands of millennials and stuff like that. But that isn't that with this deflation, that isn't what happens. I'm gonna pause this real quick, because the deflation was shifting the wealth out of the hands of everyday people and into the hands of the people that had bought bonds to fund the Civil War. And like they deserve to get a payout despite bankers just irritate me. So they're like, oh, we deserve money at pre-war prices, but like, what's the compensation for the people who had all their legs blown off and just died in droves and stuff like that? Like, somehow the banker always gets compensated, but the person that actually, sacrificed blood, sweat, and tears to make that stuff happen never seems to get compensated. Anyway, this is a political ad that talks about the Croplean system, right? So he's got farm mortgage right there, and then your Uncle Sam will advance money on crops and something. Crops and farmers loans to farmers without interest, free transportation of all greenbackers wish to blah blah blah. I don't know. Anyway, basically you would have to mortgage your house to the Croplean people to be able to furnish anything. And so instead they ended up collectivizing a bunch of these mortgages together along with promises of the next year's crop, and that's how they would pay their loans off. And it got basically so bad that after they mortgaged all that stuff, they basically became subservient to the crop person because they would have to say, okay, well, you can have my next year's crop when that comes in, and that will cover what that will cover what I owe you, right? And then the next year's crop come in, and it always falls short because their interest is insane, and also because of deflation. And so then it's like, okay, and then it would just end up in this cycle where the merchant just gets to collect everything and then give the merchant enough to keep him alive and basically be his slave without having to actually, take care of them like they had in the slave times. So that was kind of interesting. We'll unpause this now. And so, yeah, so then the thing shifts from being an agrarian cooperative into a political movement because of the sub-treasury plan that was invented, and they realized that this is something that needs to take off, or it's not going to, this has to be implemented through politics and through Congress, or it can't get implemented. And so they start this populist movement, and they do okay, but similar things happen, like what happened in the 2020 election, where fraud was committed, ballots were stuffed, and all that. And so, at least in the South, where they're primarily combating Democrats, they couldn't get through, and they couldn't get any any of their people to win. They were taking pretty good percentages. I think the highest that they had was 40 or 45% in some of these areas. So that was, it showed promising signs, but eventually it just kind of ran out of steam. And that was because there was like kind of a bifurcation and a separation of ideas, because in certain areas of because it was a very large area of the country that they were trying to conglomerate. And so, but they would pretty much only had agrarian people on their side, and to actually win these elections, they needed to get some of the city people, the working class of the city, involved. And there just wasn't the right thing that went along with this. And this kind of energy and this stuff that happened, and the eventually failings of kind of the populist movement, would roll into the progressive area and some of their succeedings. But it gave the banks enough time to kind of get their tendrils in and kind of jump in front of the parade, as it were, to direct things and get things like the Federal Reserve and some of the other stuff, so that so that while the changes happened, they were somewhat superficial, because they were the ones still in control at the end of the day. So, so the progressive era had its problems, and so the main bifurcation that happened was between whether or not they wanted to go ahead with the sub-treasury system and basically be greenbackers, which meant fiat money, or if they wanted to, there was a push to do silver. So we had switched back to the gold standard after the Civil War, and the gold standard made it so that they could pay off their war debts and all that stuff. But then eventually we had a bimetal system before, where silver and gold, and so they wanted to allow silver to be circulated in the economy, and they wanted to be able to print as much of that as humanly possible. And that would help with this deflationary thing, start to cause some inflation, and really help relieve people of these crushing debts that they were in. But but people saw that backing this would basically undermine their entire platform and make it so that they wouldn't actually get the sub-treasury system that they wanted. And so there was this big fight, and that's where basically the whole thing ended, was when they wanted William Jennings Bryan to get the nominee, or they didn't want him to get the nominee because he was a Democrat that was basically a free silver, pro-silver type person, and they wanted somebody to be a greenback, but there was basically there's a fusionist and a fundamentalist, or a radical, two different movements, and that kind of tore the whole thing apart, because the people who basically wanted to play nice and figure out a way to fuse their ideas with the Democratic Party and shift the Democratic Party slightly, and then go forward with those, versus the people that wanted to create their own party and strike out anew and win the nominees that way. And eventually this did cause an overall shift in the thought process and how things were done in the country. So that was interesting, and it's the thing that forced the end of the I hope I'm not coming off of basically it's the thing that led to Republican dominance in the early 19th century, because the populist movement ended up splitting the Democratic base and made it so all the Republicans ended up getting in, and then over time that kind of caused a shift in the overall things, and people started to leave behind their the wedge issues that were developed during the Civil War, and started to develop new kind of different ways of thinking, new modus operandi, and that was mainly that change mainly was something that happened because of the populist movement, but it wasn't because it didn't go in the direction they wanted it to, basically. So that's kind of a summary of what happened. It was very interesting. I'm excited to talk about the sub-treasury system more, because I think it's very fascinating and doesn't get talked about enough. It was one of the most fascinating things that I've ever heard of back when I first read about it in Bare Metal. And now with this populist moment, I have a better understanding of what it is. That's why I didn't talk about it previously. So yeah, I think this is all really good stuff, and hopefully you guys find it interesting and give it a read. This is a decent synopsis of it, but I think it's still worth a read, and it's a really easy read too. The name of the book is The Populist Moment: A Short History of the Agrarian Revolt in America, and it is by Lawrence Goodwin. If you just look up The Populist Moment, I'm sure it pops up. And that's basically all. Sorry for the hiatus, and thank you guys all for listening, and I will see you guys next time.